So we designed this talk to be more of a roundtable discussion. So the general idea is that we're going to listen a little bit and learn about what the Brilliance Narrative is and what that looks like in STEM and more specifically in physics. And then we're going to watch an amazing TED Talk that I really like. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And then we're going to really try to engage in some roundtable discussion and talk about what that looks like in the physics culture and then also just generally in STEM. So the Brilliance Narrative is this belief that raw innate talent is the main requirement for success. And while that kind of sounds like a good idea, women and minorities are generally stereotyped as not having this talent. So when you think of someone who's brilliant, normally people don't have an image of a woman or a minority student pop up in their head. And this idea was tested in 2017 when almost 2,000 professionals were surveyed, ranging from 30 different academic fields, and they were asked to rate on a belief scale how strongly they believed that the trait of brilliance mattered for success in their discipline. And they also surveyed social scientists. It wasn't just pure STEM fields. So fields ended up having higher scores were some of the STEM fields like you would think of math and physics, but philosophy and a few others also were lumped in there. They ended up awarding even fewer advanced degrees, so like graduate level degrees or post-bac degrees to women and African-American students as compared to lower scoring fields like neuroscience and psychology. So the idea is that the lower you scored on this scale, the less you associated brilliance as a core trait of success. And the sad thing is that many of the results suggested that people in these fields implicitly equated brilliance with white males. So I would suggest that you try to keep a few of these tidbits in your mind as we watch the TED Talk and learn about the dangers of a single story, and then we'll come back and participate in a discussion. Let me know if you can hear it.
Yep, we got it.
Okay.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps, My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
Bear with me while I share another screen. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to watch the TED Talk, what do you think are some examples of single stories that are told about our field? And you can feel free to unmute or turn your video on.
Could you define our field?
I guess in this
Specifically
case, it would be
physics,
physics.
science, yeah. Or in general, or?
I mean, you can talk about
Life.
whichever you like, but any one of them is fine.
So I can get the ball rolling. One of the most common things that I hear about this is how kind of when we talk about a shorthand for genius, you want to say someone's a genius, you say they're an Einstein, they're like Einstein. And whenever you try to kind of like talk about the seminal scientist and this thing, you know, when the peak that you want to be, it's people like Einstein basically that pop up. And that's one of the reasons why on our website we try to do the monthly thing where we highlight, you know, scientists from underrepresented groups to try to bring more visibility to that there's a million more people than just Einstein that have been working on everything, every possible field of science you could look into.
Kind of to build off of that, there's the single story that science presents to everyone else, whereas we within science know it to be false. Like, for instance, the Tesla and Edison discord is something that's known to people within science that have looked it up and know that true story. But outside of science, science as a field has kind of presented that, oh no, it was Edison. This was all of Edison's work and how incredible he is. And that's what's known to others in other fields unless they really dig and find the true story there.
So if we're thinking about these single stories that are being told, are we able to identify who's kind of continuing to instill this single story in new generations of either physicists or scientists? And I mean, just like Jenna was saying, when you're referred to or people refer to you as Einstein, like that's continually being told and it's continually being passed down. And then are we able to think about intrinsically in ourselves, are we knowingly or unknowingly involved in continuing to tell these single stories?
I think it's just part of a bigger problem. The general public is has abysmal education in general, and it's not getting better. And the example of stories like Tesla and Edison, or all the way to anti-vaxxer and everything, and also stereotypes about who is doing science and so on, I think it's just different sides of the same thing. Also, climate change, the general public is extremely poorly educated and has very little understanding about what science is and how science is being done. I mean, people who are in physics, I don't think that there are many or even noticeable amount who seriously have gender stereotypes in theoretical physics, for instance. That might have been 50 years ago, but I don't know anybody now that would think so. But if you ask general public, they definitely have stereotypes. And that's just part of their lack of understanding of what science, modern science is.
So just so I can make sure I'm understanding correctly, you think that people that aren't physicists, so anyone just on the outside looking in, that they're the ones who are telling the single stories, and then
Yep.
within
Yeah.
physics, it's
Yeah,
not.
I don't think that these things actually originate or perpetrate the science. And as a matter of fact, the better professionally is the particular group of scientists, the less likely they are to subscribe to single stories. But those are not the people who determine whatever general perception in the society. And in fact, they probably determine less now than 50 years ago when people was in awe of science. Now people despise scientists and think that scientists are essentially puppets of government, which tell what they are, what they want. And when the scientists try to explain, in particular, about single stories and about variety of thinking and who is actually doing science, that doesn't fall through. I don't know.
And I guess one thing that I kind of have to think about this is that I agree in some places where like it's definitely a lot of it is the media and how people who are not scientists are kind of presenting this. Because most scientists today don't want to keep people out of science. They want to keep it going. I mean, there's a reason why like people are really into recruitment and retention and trying to fix with that. The problem is, I think, is that with so much systemic kind of images and language kind of being pushed from an early age all the way on, saying that you don't really belong here, this isn't really your place, that can make things even inadvertent just out of ignorance things basically from scientists that want to do it kind of hit harder than they would if it was just everything all equal and everything was just a perfect like everyone's already kind of are starting at an equal setting.
I think there's also something to be said for people coming into science having only been fed a single story about science. So I know that coming into physics, I had only known a single story about physics, about what I should expect, that this is, top of the top, you have to be super mega intelligent in order to make it. And I know that for me coming in, that made it very difficult for me to, for instance, ask questions because I assumed that this is something that I should know. And gradually the more that I've gone forward in physics and the more people that I've met that also have similar questions to what I would have a question of in class, that kind of a thing, I've been able to kind of work through that. But that's still a harmful single story, and that can definitely cause people to leave our fields, especially if they don't find that support group that says, hey, no, it's okay that you have this question, I have this question too. People don't just inherently know physics, they learn it. No one is born and understands all of Maxwell's field equations. Like that's not how that happens. You have to learn it, and we have to combat this single story that we're being taught and unknowingly involved in to some extent, that asking questions is quote unquote bad.
And kind of also piggybacking off of that too, when I the story people give for physicists also, and the picture that I always had in my mind basically is just like someone who lives and breathes physics. Like that is just what they do. They have nothing else. They have nothing else kind of getting in their way or taking up their time. And I know when I first started, I had a part-time job. I was a primary caregiver. Like my time was very, very limited to actually be able to study and do well. And it's kind of difficult to feel like, okay, maybe this just like I shouldn't be doing this. And obviously, clearly, I got past it. I had very good faculty that were very helpful in saying, no, it's fine. You can have you have enough going on. Let's work on this together and do what you're able to do. But that is something that if I was less outgoing and less, willing to talk to faculty about it, I may have been dropped kind of.
Yeah, and I think that that's also really related to kind of like the brilliance culture and the brilliance narrative. So while I do agree that there are stories being told about scientists and physicists from the outside looking in and kind of perceiving us as like these crazy radical scientists trying to push science down your throat sometimes, I do think that there are also issues from the inside where, like what Natasha and Jenna were mentioning, that as a woman walking into a classroom, there's probably not going to be that many of us learning physics. And there's a lot of unspoken, but sometimes just spoken or like slighted discrimination that is trying to kind of gatekeep and keep underrepresented students and minorities outside of the STEM fields.
Kathryn, I think we should here distinguish two separate effects, external and internal. Unfortunately, external is more visible, but it's also easier to fight with. And external is that what people outside think about a particular group, let's say women in this case. Much more dangerous is what actually Jenna alluded to, is the stereotype which was instilled in this group at the early age. You may have heard about this famous experiment when two groups of female students were given a mathematics test. And I believe that was at MIT. And half of them, and all of them were Asian females. Half of them were told that this is an experiment to test, we don't know if this is correct or not, but to test hypothesis that women are less capable in math than men. The other were told that they are testing the hypothesis that Asians are more talented in math than Caucasian and other ethnic groups. Amazingly, even though there were random selection, the first group did the test considerably worse than the second group. The only difference is the first group were told that the hypothesis to be tested is that they are worse than others. And the second group was told that they are testing hypotheses that are better than others. So your success is very, very strongly correlated to what you think of yourself. Like Jenna said, if you walk in the class and expect that you are not on par with everybody else and expect that other people think so, you will perform worse than if you are very confident. I have a story to share from my own childhood, but I grew up as a member of a considerably discriminated minority in the Soviet Union, Jewish. It was not a secret, and people were explicitly discriminated like African Americans 100 years ago in this country, literally. And yet I was growing up with a stereotype that we are very talented and we are very strong, and we should, and you, little Igor, you should overcome that, even though the stakes will be against you. And that was very helpful. I went in confident, expecting discrimination, but I was confident that I'm good. If I were thought that I was weak, I would fail.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Oh, I think Joe raised his hand.
You can go ahead and finish up that thread first, then I can.
Okay, I was
say
just
something.
going to say, I agree with what you're saying about kind of like the confidence that you bring in and how much you perceive yourself as belonging in that culture can affect, your success or how much because I think that also comes back to physics identity and sense of belonging. And the more you feel like you belong, the more comfortable you'll be, and maybe the more willing you'll be to take risks or to participate more. That's all I was going to say.
I was going to say that can you hear me? Yeah, the story that I was sort of told and read when I was a kid was a very different story than what science really is. Like when you read about it, it seems very linear. Like one discovery leads naturally to the next discovery and so on in a linear sequence. Very clean, very straightforward. And that's not what science is at all, right? Science is mostly just a lot of people bumbling around trying to figure something out and see what happens, you know, and just try enough things and eventually something works. And I didn't get that sense at all, you know, before becoming a scientist. And I think that can possibly skew your expectations coming in as a student too, is when you realize, oh my God, this stuff is hard. And a lot of the times what I'm doing doesn't work. Well, that's normal. That's the way it's expected to be, and not to feel bad about that.
Yeah, I definitely really agree with that. Oh, go ahead, Ms. Sargent, Professor.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a stereotype of the single-minded scientist who from the age of 3 has known exactly what they wanted to do and has pursued it with great enthusiasm and is brilliant to begin with. And you know, it's in education, one of the things we worry about is people who feel like it's all because I am so good, and that you don't have to put in a lot of work in order to succeed. And I think maybe that's a stereotype that's inhibiting for people who didn't have that feeling from the age of whatever, that this is the real thing they want to do in life. And then they feel like they can't do it when they encounter those difficult times that we all run into. So just another perspective, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely really agree with that. And I can say I was someone that knew that I was going to do science really early. I mean, it kind of evolved from astronomy to astrophysics, but it wasn't too big of a leap. And I know that the first time that I really struggled in a class, that completely destroyed like my feeling of like, oh yes, this is what I wanted to do in my life, because you know, it's like we've been talking about, you're told like, oh yeah, this discovery and then that discovery, and it was just so easy and it happened and it was 1 year apart, it was no problem. And then I struggled in a class, you know, one time, and I was like, I need to escort myself out of this field. Clearly I don't belong here if I can't make it through the space level class. Obviously that's not the case, and that's not how science works, as Joe said. But that single story is so harmful, especially when you're, you know, just at the beginning of your physical career, and you don't have your support system yet. You're not necessarily comfortable going to professors and saying, I don't understand this. You're in a large lecture hall with, you know, hundreds of other students, and you're struggling. And at that point in time, the easier way out is to just leave rather than to struggle through, because you know, as soon as you have that thought in your head like maybe I don't belong here, that thought is really hard to get out. And that single story is not something that you unlearn for a very long time, or even that you're told is not true for a very long time, which is unfortunate.
I have a specific story about that related to also what kind of what Becky and Joe were saying earlier, is like I'm the stereotype of someone that went through so many different majors and so many different potential jobs and everything, that and that I finally landed on astronomy, and it was kind of like I need something to do. I like math and this looks cool. I'm going to do it. And I remember the first test that I took, it was in Joe's 210, and I was ready to just like, and I like the next day I was about to go to his office and be like, I'm out, like, sorry, bye. And he was like, oh, congratulations, you feel like you did a really good job on the test. And like, I didn't do a great job on the test. I was about as standard as everybody else. It was just a really hard test, but like, it was really good to like that was the first that I said, that was the kind of the first experience that I had of someone being like, it's normal to struggle for this. Like, it's expected. You don't have to, like, science is not you knowing something immediately. It's not you going directly from A to B, which even that took me until doing research to really realize how fucking nonlinear it is. So
So I think that this is a really great discussion. I think we can guide it a little bit more to think about how it can inform our own practice moving forward. So let's try to think about how we can combat the weaponizing of these different single stories that are used to keep underrepresented students from not only entering physics, but also establishing themselves as physicists or feeling like they belong, like Igor was saying, succeeding and being recognized as physicists by others in the field. And then after that, we can also think about how do we keep talking about these successes and these positive and uplifting stories of folks from historically excluded groups that are in physics while still acknowledging the work that needs to be done to make physics culture less exclusionary and more inclusive and accepting.
So I think one thing that's really helping now actually is Twitter. There's such a large population of scientists on Twitter that talk about their research very openly, very honestly. Like they say, you know, I just hit a wall, this is terrible, or, you know, or they'll make it even funny. And then somebody will say, you know, I've been dealing with this error in my code for 3 days before I realized it's just because I forgot, you know, to end a for loop somewhere. And, you know, seeing that you're not the only person that's messing up, you know, especially messing up in like really tiny ways, it helps. And I think that helps change the single story of how science goes, because you're seeing all of these, you know, levels of scientists from undergraduates to professional professors talking about their struggles together and people helping each other as a community. So that's a really helpful change, and especially with how much of a population there is on Twitter that's in high school or might be interested in going into science, I think that's already something that's helping change the single story of science.
Yeah, I think social media has been you know, good in this respect because it's been able to connect a lot of, especially, you know, in my experience, connect graduate students together. And I don't use it. I use it, you know, to not only do work, but also just to sort of get perspective on how other people are dealing with graduate school, you know, how people are dealing with issues, if they're having similar issues that I'm having. And so it's as simple as, you know, I can go to a Facebook group where there's a bunch of graduate students in all sorts of disciplines in science, and I can see posts of things that are happening to them that I go, I understand that. Okay, it's not just me, you know, and it's helpful in that sense to see that you're not the only person that's dealing with this thing, that there is this broader system that needs to be addressed. You're not the problem, you know. So I think that's been good, is that it provides more perspective than I think graduate students had in the past, at least outside of their program.
And I think one big part of this too is recruitment. And one thing that I know we've kind of had a shift to recently with our own recruitment practices is bringing more student involvement in, like having student stories, like having, I know Ryan had his like profile written about him when he had his NASA press release. And we're all pretty involved in like when this new grad students come or when new undergrads come or transfer students, where people like where they say you can talk to this person, and they talk to us and we give them a very honest review of kind of what actually is like, what is the good, the bad, and the ugly of being in science, but what is, you know, the overall good that comes out of it and the excitement that comes out of it, so that people go into it with open eyes. And if they have trouble or if they have problems later on, they feel more comfortable to actually say something because they know that it's not just them. They know it's not some, you know, horrible mark on their character. It's just humanity.
Prior to the pandemic, how useful was the student lounge for, you know, students getting to know stories of other scientists and other students? Was that really helpful, or are there ways that could be improved in the future?
Oh, that was extraordinarily helpful. I mean, that was what I think helped a lot of people stay in physics. Was the first time that you wandered into the physics lounge, usually somewhere around the second semester of sophomore year, and you didn't quite feel like you should be there. You kind of felt like you were going to be smitten down as soon as you walked through the door, and then you weren't, and then you got friends, and then you got homework help from everybody, and it was great. And yeah, having that community of students that, you know, very deeply understands the field that you're in, the difficulties that go along with that, and especially since we, I mean, I know in comparison to a lot of my other friends that aren't in physics, I usually had the brunt of the workload in terms of homework. So I never had time to hang out or go do anything. But when we were all in the physics lounge, you could be simultaneously goofing off and doing homework, and it all worked itself out. Yeah, so I can at least say for me, that was a very positive experience.
Yeah, I know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think go ahead.
I know in my personal experience, I don't know if I would have made it through my degree without the physics lounge. I got a lot of support from the friends that I made, hours and hours of working on problems and discussing issues and talking about not only homework issues, but also just, you know, department issues and personal struggles. You know, there was a support group there that I was able to develop. And so that was a really big, important part. And of course, you know, we certainly did, you know, unknowingly propagate these single story things because we looked up to, you know, these scientists, and in some sense we looked up to them, but we also, in the same sense, we felt like we were so small because you talk about these scientists and you talk about Einstein as the single story, but no one really talks about how long it took him to develop his theories. No one talks about that it took him like years and years and years to come up with general relativity. Everyone just talks about how brilliant it is, and it's beautiful. But the time it took him to do that is totally lost on people. And so, you know, that's these single stories, and when you have these small knit groups, it's you have support, but it's also hard as the students to sort of see. It's hard to see what you don't see. It's hard to see the process when you're learning the process, you know, and so that's where we really need the professors to sort of show us and say, hey, it's okay to feel that way. And a lot of times, you know, I had professors that absolutely said that. They said, you're going to get there. This is part of the process. Don't worry. But that was really important, was having someone more advanced in the field, you know, say, hey, you're going to get there. So that was sort of a tangent. I apologize. But in general, yeah, physics lounge, great.
I will second though that it is very intimidating to go into the first time. I know I had to be like hyped on people outside of the department to even just step foot in there because I was like, I don't like, I remember my biggest concern was like, what if there's no seats? Like I have to walk in and walk out. That's going to be so weird. Like, and then they're going to remember my face. I'm going to go back in there ever again. Like it just like, it was so silly. But I'm sure I was the only person that had that amount of anxiety about it, because I've learned ever since then that all of us did. So I don't like, so like I'm trying to think of some ways so we can kind of, and I know also in the past, you know, talking to Tasha, that it's been a lot more outwardly welcoming than it was when I first started, where like if someone walks in, you immediately get like, oh hey, how you doing? Like come over here, what's your name, and all of that. And I think that also really helps. Just if someone walks in, they don't have to do too much past the walking in, basically, because that can be scary.
Yeah, I think if we could find ways to encourage students to start using it at the beginning rather than waiting, you know, 3 or 4 semesters. But I don't know what the answers are. Like last semester with COVID, everything being online, I tried to have all the new students, physics and astronomy majors, meet once a week on Fridays, just as a way to get to know each other and work through problems together and stuff. And there are like 20 students in that category, and only 3 would bother to participate, you know. And I just don't know what's the answer, how to get these students early on to get more engaged in this sort of thing.
So I know for right now, the Discord is really helping in the absence of the physics lounge. And I think it's actually making a lot of underclassmen speak up a little bit more because you're just typing. You know what I mean? Like you're just behind a screen, you just have to ask a question. It's a lot easier when you're not staring down a bunch of seniors and you say, hello, everyone, I need physics 1 help. It's a lot easier to just type a question and leave your phone alone for a little bit. But when we're back in person, I know there were plans by myself and a couple of other people that frequented the physics lounge to make it a little bit more quote unquote homey. I know that we were going to get like a kettle and a little like tea and hot cocoa station going so that people could just have that. And the muralists were going to paint in the physics lounge before the pandemic hit. I don't think that ever ended up happening, and like all of that kind of stuff. And it was getting a lot better towards the end. We were getting a lot more underclassmen coming in. I think it helped that we were also a very exuberant bunch, and just genuinely enjoyed being in the physics lounge up until the pandemic hit. I think it's probably gone now, but there was a large life-size drawing of Dr. Doofenshmirtz on the whiteboard. And we got a good couple of people that would come in to say, hey, what's that? And we would explain it. And then they'd be like, okay, well, while I'm here, I actually had a question about physics, if you guys would help me out. So it's been getting better, but I think it's just always going to be something that's very daunting to walk into a room of people that are older than you and know a lot more physics than you and ask for help. Yeah.
And one thing that can help with this too is having, like, I know for me, like you introduced me to so many different grad students, so many different upperclassmen or whatever, that were just interested in similar things. If either spectrum or just if someone is interested, comes to a professor or whatever, and it's like, I'm interested in doing this, finding an upperclassman that does something similar, so that if you go in, you know that you know one person. And so if like, that makes it a little bit less scary too, because like, okay, like worst case scenario, I'll go sit next to that one person, I'll go ask them a question and then leave basically. And that kind of just breaks the ice a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, I know trying to engage with students in an online environment is very difficult, and it can be kind of disheartening if you're just like staring at a Zoom room full of like dark screens and no one's showing their video. But I think it's also important to remember that Zoom fatigue is very, very real. And sometimes there's just like a lot going on in people's backgrounds, and maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing their video, or even like faculty just humanizing themselves. I know that like I definitely appreciate whenever a pet makes a cameo appearance in my class, and just like fun little quirky things like that make whatever is being taught a lot more relatable, at least in my opinion. I know I can't speak for everyone, but I do think that there are also positives to the online environment. I think people, as they get more comfortable, will get involved and engaged more too. So I think that we are out of time. We really appreciate all of you coming here, and we're going to post the recording on our new YouTube channel, and we will send it out to all of you whenever it's ready. And we hope to see you next week too.